Hey everyone, and welcome back for another deep dive. This time, we're looking at the latest in lunar exploration. We've got these three articles from One Neves. They're really interesting. We're going to try to figure out what's going on with all these lunar missions.
Yeah, there's a lot to talk about.
It seems like a really exciting time for lunar exploration. Our goal today is to not just see what missions are happening, but also why they're happening. Like, what are the motivating factors? So, are you ready to take a deep dive?
Absolutely. I'm ready to get into it.
Okay, perfect. So let's start off by talking about this article about two astronauts who are stuck on the International Space Station. Their trip has been extended for a lot longer than they expected.
Yeah, so uh, it's a real shame for these astronauts. It really shows how delays in space travel can have these ripple effects.
Mm.
So NASA has been using SpaceX's Dragon spacecraft to rotate their crews.
Hmm.
But because they needed a new Dragon capsule for the Crew 10 mission, it's caused this backlog of astronauts.
Oh.
So that mission has been pushed back to at least late March 2025. And the astronauts who are waiting to come back were part of Crew 9. And they were supposed to come back on a Dragon capsule, but now NASA has to figure out a new way to get them home.
So is that where Boeing's Starliner was supposed to come in?
Yeah, exactly. They wanted to have a backup. But you remember Starliner's first test flight with a crew had all those problems.
Right.
Engine failures, helium leaks, or all kinds of issues.
Yeah, that's true. And it's a good reminder that even with all the meticulous planning that goes into these things, space travel still has all these things that can go wrong.
Definitely. And it really makes you think about the implications for Boeing. What do all the Starliner's problems mean for them in the long run?
Yeah. I mean, having to bring Starliner back without a crew must have been a big setback.
Yeah, it was. NASA's commitment to the Commercial Crew Program depends on having two companies that are reliable. And if Boeing can't consistently deliver, it could hurt their future in the program. It might even force NASA to just rely on SpaceX.
Right. At least for now.
Exactly.
Wow. So these astronauts thought they were going on a one-week mission, but now it's going to be several months. And this delay is adding another month to their, their unexpected space vacation.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about the human element of all this, right? Astronauts go through so much training, but being in a confined environment like the ISS for such a long time, it can be really tough, both mentally and physically.
Definitely.
It really raises all these questions about how sustainable long-term missions are. And it makes you think about the support systems that are needed to make sure astronauts are doing okay.
For sure. Especially because there have been all those rumors about Suni Williams and her health.
Oh, right.
Because the mission has been extended.
Yeah, but Williams has said that those claims about her losing weight or having health problems, they're not true. NASA's very strict about monitoring the health of their astronauts. And if there were real concerns about her well-being, they would definitely do something.
That makes sense. It's easy to forget that we usually focus on the technology when we think about space travel.
Yeah.
But we don't always think about the human side of it and how resilient you have to be to adapt to unexpected things in space.
Definitely. These astronauts are pushing the boundaries of exploration,
Yeah.
even when they have to deal with all these challenges that they weren't expecting. It's pretty incredible.
It really is. So it's pretty amazing how this whole situation with the astronauts just shows how much we rely on space travel, but also how limited it is. But while we're trying to deal with these challenges here, it seems like the private sector is making a lot of progress with missions to the moon. There's an article here about two robotic explorers getting ready to land on the moon.
That's right. Firefly Aerospace's Blue Ghost and ISpace's Resilience landers are set to launch on a SpaceX Falcon 9 in January. It's pretty cool to see that even with NASA's delays, lunar exploration is still moving forward.
Yeah, it's exciting to see these commercial space companies playing such a big role. What do you think will happen in the long run if these private companies are delivering stuff to the moon all the time?
I think it could be a total game changer. If we can get to the moon more easily, it'll make missions more frequent and it'll bring down costs. It could even open up opportunities for things like extracting resources from the moon. We might even see companies starting to build infrastructure on the moon, like landing pads or habitats.
So where are these landers going to land on the moon? The article mentioned some pretty interesting places.
They're both going to Lunar Maria. Those are the big, dark plains that were formed by volcanic eruptions a long time ago. Blue Ghost is heading for Mare Crisium. And that one's really unique because it also has this giant impact crater from an asteroid billions of years ago. Just imagine what we could learn from studying that crater.
That's incredible. And what about Resilience? Where's that one landing?
Resilience is going to Mare Frigoris, which is in the northern part of the moon. That area is known for having all kinds of different geological features. It's a great place to test out new tech for lunar exploration.
So both missions are going to really fascinating landing sites, but it sounds like they have different goals, right? What will they be doing on the moon?
Blue Ghost is mainly focused on research. It has 10 instruments to gather data about the lunar sunset and to study the moon's regolith.
Regolith.
Yeah, that's like the loose rock and dust on the surface. They want to see how the regolith reacts to the sun.
I'm curious, what can we learn from studying the lunar sunset? Will it tell us anything about how the moon formed or evolved?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's not just about a pretty view. When we analyze how light changes as the sun sets on the moon, we can learn about the moon's atmosphere. It's incredibly thin, but it's still there. And this can tell us about how the moon has changed over time.
What about resilience? What's its mission?
Resilience is going to be deploying a rover called Tenacious. It's going to explore the surface. And the cool thing is, it's carrying instruments from Japanese companies, so it's a real international collaboration.
It's great to see that kind of global cooperation happening in space. It seems like we're moving toward a more collaborative approach to figuring out the moon's secrets. Speaking of approaches, the article said that both missions are launching on the same rocket, but they'll be taking different paths to get to the moon.
That's right. Blue Ghost will orbit the Earth for about 25 days before it goes into lunar orbit. But Resilience is going to take a longer route. It's more energy efficient, it'll do a close flyby of the moon, and then use that to slingshot itself into a lower energy orbit.
It's amazing how many different ways there are to travel in space. It really shows how creative and smart the engineers who work on these missions have to be. It seems like the private sector is doing incredibly well with lunar exploration, but what about NASA's Artemis program? The article about that makes it sound like things aren't going as smoothly.
Yeah, unfortunately, while the uncrewed Artemis I test flight gave us a lot of useful information, it also showed us some challenges. The biggest concern is the heat shield on the Orion spacecraft. It eroded a lot more than expected when it came back into the atmosphere. So now the program's timeline has been delayed, and it raises some questions about how safe future missions with a crew will be.
A problem with the heat shield sounds worrying. Can you tell me more about the issue and how it will affect the Artemis program?
Sure, the heat shield is essential for protecting astronauts from the extreme heat they experience when they re-enter the atmosphere. The Orion spacecraft comes back into the atmosphere at extremely high speeds, close to 25,000 miles per hour, and that creates a ton of friction and heat. The heat shield is supposed to absorb that heat and keep the crew safe.
I see. So what caused the heat shield to erode more than it was supposed to during Artemis's Earth?
It looks like a few different things caused it. One was the skip entry technique that Orion uses. That's where it dips in and out of the atmosphere to slow down. And although it saves fuel, it puts more stress on the heat shield. The investigation showed that because of this maneuver and a few other factors, gas built up and the pressure increased inside the heat shield, and that caused more erosion than they were expecting.
So a technique that was supposed to make the reentry more efficient ended up causing this unexpected problem. It really makes you think about how many different things you have to consider when designing for spaceflight.
Exactly. Each mission teaches us something new that we can use for future missions. It's all part of the learning curve.
Yeah, it's true that even when things go wrong, we still learn something. So what's NASA's plan for Artemis now that they have this heat shield problem?
Well, for Artemis II, the first mission with a crew, they're going to use the same heat shield, but they're going to change the way Orion re-enters the atmosphere so there's less stress on the heat shield. It's a risk, but they think it's a risk worth taking. But that also means pushing the launch date back to April 2026. And Artemis III, that's the one that's supposed to land astronauts on the moon. That one's been moved to mid-2027.
I bet these delays are frustrating, especially since China is also trying to land astronauts on the moon by 2030. It seems like we're in a new kind of space race.
Yeah, it's definitely different from the space race during the Cold War. There's competition, but there's also cooperation. Countries and companies are working towards their own goals, but everyone knows that we need to work together, especially if we want to stay on the moon for a long time.
It makes you wonder what will happen with lunar exploration. What do you think the moon will be like in, say, 10 or 20 years?
That's a tough question.
Mm.
But if things keep going the way they are, I think the moon could be a really busy place. There could be scientific outposts, mining operations, maybe even tourists.
Wow, tourists on the moon.
Yeah, it might not be that far off. Some companies are already working on ideas for lunar travel.
That would be amazing. What would it be like to be a tourist on the moon?
It would probably start with trips that orbit the moon, so people could get amazing views of the lunar surface and the Earth. And eventually, they might start having short trips to the surface so people could walk on the moon and see what it's like.
It would be a totally different way of seeing things. It makes you think, if we end up staying on the moon, what would a lunar society be like?
That's an interesting question. The moon is a harsh environment. People would have to come up with new solutions for building habitats, managing resources, even just figuring out how to live together.
That's so true. So we started by talking about astronauts who are stuck in orbit, and now we're imagining what life on the moon might be like. It's been a wild ride.
Yeah, and it just shows how everything in space exploration is connected. Every little delay, every ambitious mission, it all helps us understand what it would take to explore and live in other worlds.
So for those listening who want to learn more, what should they look into?
I think it would be really interesting to learn about the history of lunar exploration. Reading about missions from the past, the successful ones and the ones that didn't go so well, it gives you a better understanding of what's happening today.
Yeah, that's a good idea.
And keep an eye on how NASA and private companies are working together. Sometimes they work together, sometimes they compete, but they're both pushing the limits of what's possible in space.
It really feels like a new era of discovery and innovation.
It definitely is. With every mission, whether it's a robot or a spacecraft with humans, we learn more and more about the universe and where we fit into it.
It's been a pleasure talking about this with you today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into lunar exploration.
Thanks for having me.
And to everyone listening, keep looking up at the stars, keep asking questions, and never stop exploring the wonders of space. We'll see you next time.